The first light of dawn slipped through the cracks of the slave quarters like a thief. The air was cold, damp with December's bite, and inside a cramped room lay Esther Johnson, cook, survivor, and prisoner of Thornhill Mansion. At 42, her back bore the scars of 3 decades in bondage, yet her hands were steady. Those hands had built the reputation of William Thornhill as Charleston's most celebrated host. His feasts dazzled South Carolina's elite. His parties were whispered about for weeks afterward, and his name carried weight in the city's highest circles. But no one remembered the woman who cooked it all. Tonight, that would change. You know, by the close of the Thornhill Christmas ball, the governor of South Carolina, judges, merchants, and masters of Charleston society would raise glasses to their ruin, and Esther would be the one who served it to them. This is the story of how a woman denied her children, denied her freedom, denied even the dignity of her name, chose to serve her masters their most memorable meal. Charleston in Enslaved was a city of contradictions. Its harbor bustled with ships bringing in spices, sugar, and rum. Mansions lined East Bay Street, their white columns gleaming in the sun. Behind those columns, enslaved people labored unseen, polishing silver, scrubbing floors, preparing elaborate meals they would never taste. Inside the Thornhill estate, Esther commanded the kitchen like a general, but outside its walls, she was property. Her skill had saved her from the auction block more than once, especially when Master Thornhill's gambling debts nearly ruined him. To society, she was invisible, except for the dishes that left her hands. On this December morning, as frost edged the mansion's windows, the air inside the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and yesterday's ashes. Esther moved with practiced efficiency, kneading dough, seasoning ham, and laying out eggs for the mistress's breakfast. Her movement seemed calm, but behind her eyes flickered the weight of memory. Children sold, screams silenced, years stolen. The peace of the kitchen shattered at the sound of Mistress Caroline Thornhill's voice. "Esther, where is my breakfast?" Caroline appeared at the doorway, draped in silk even before the sun was high. Her face, pinched and pale, wore an expression of constant dissatisfaction. She sniffed at the air, as if the kitchen itself offended her. "Coming directly, mistress," Esther answered, carefully hiding any trace of resentment. The tray was prepared with meticulous care. Eggs exactly as Caroline preferred, thin slices of ham, fresh biscuits. Esther poured steaming coffee into a porcelain cup. Her hands trembled slightly, remembering last week when Thornhill himself had hurled a lukewarm cup at her, scalding her arm. She still wore the bandage beneath her sleeve. Caroline's eyes narrowed. "Make sure the coffee is hot this time. William has business in town. He cannot be kept waiting." Without another glance, the mistress swept away. Later that morning, the kitchen door creaked open again. This time it was William Thornhill himself, his heavy steps filling the space. His breath reeked of whiskey, though the sun was barely risen. "Caroline says you've been slow this morning," he drawled, his tone thick with menace. "Perhaps you're getting too old for this position." "I saw a fine young cook at the auction yesterday." Esther kept her eyes lowered. "No, master, I'm well working as always." Nick Thornhill's fingers brushed the edge of her headscarf, then lingered against her cheek. His touch made her stomach twist. "Oh, you'd better be," he said. "The Christmas ball must be perfect. Governor Johnson himself will be here. Everyone's expecting your oyster stew." With that, he left, leaving the kitchen filled with silence and the faint smell of liquor. Esther exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath. She resumed grinding herbs, each strike of the pestle against mortar echoing like a heartbeat of hatred. In Charleston, enslaved cooks like Esther were paradoxical figures. They were both invaluable and vulnerable. Their culinary skills shaped reputations and fortunes, yet their lives were precarious. A single mistake could bring punishment, and even their talents could not shield their families from being torn apart. Enslaved cooks often knew the intimate preferences of the city, its most powerful men, knowledge that was both currency and danger. For Esther, the kitchen was the only domain where she held a shred of control. It was also the stage where she would one day deliver her justice. That night, in the quarters, Esther lay awake beside young Ida, a house servant, no older than 13. The girl cried in her sleep, flinching from the memory of the lash across her back. Esther's heart hardened at the sound, for it echoed her own children's screams. James, sold at 7. Sarah, sold at 10. She had been powerless to stop it, then. But as the moonlight traced patterns across the floor, she touched the loose board beneath her bed, where a small box lay hidden. Inside was a packet of white powder, given years ago by an old root woman who whispered, "For the day when suffering becomes too great to bear." No, Esther had kept it all this time, never daring to use it. But tonight, as Ida whimpered in her sleep, Esther began to imagine a different kind of feast. One not for celebration, but for reckoning. The winter sun climbed higher, but its light brought no warmth to the quarters or the kitchens of Thornhill Mansion. The white columns gleamed over Charleston harbor, a monument to wealth. But inside the estate, every detail of comfort was purchased with suffering. For Esther, every dish she prepared was a reminder of what had been taken from her. That evening, old Jeremiah, the stable hand, shuffled into the kitchen. At nearly 70, his body bent with years of hard labor. Jeremiah was one of the few who connected Esther to her past. He had known her mother before disease carried her away. His voice rasped like dry leaves. Miss Esther," he whispered, leaning close so the overseer wouldn't hear. "They're taking Lucy to the auction tomorrow." Esther froze, her hand hovering above the stew pot. Lucy, just 13, was Ida's younger sister, a delicate child with wide eyes who had only begun training as a house servant. What was sixtrus spree de spruces sabruris presprusums? "Ew! Why?" Esther asked. Though she already knew, Jeremiah's eyes flicked toward the door. "Master's debts. Lost big at cards last night. Paid it with flesh." Esther felt a numbness spread through her chest. She had seen it before, too many times. Her own children had been sold the same way. James at 7, Sarah at 10. She hadn't even been allowed a goodbye. That night, Ida cried, until her small body shook. Esther lay beside her, silent, her heart breaking as the sound carried her back through time. The wind outside rattled the shutters, echoing like chains. Esther stared at the ceiling, remembering the little box beneath the floorboard. The day was coming. The next morning, Esther chopped carrots with practiced rhythm. Each strike of her knife was precise, clean, almost mechanical. Yet in her mind, it was not vegetables beneath her blade. She remembered James, eager and bright, who once plucked herbs from the garden with her. She remembered Sarah, her daughter, quick with a smile, taken on her 10th birthday to pay for Thornhill's debts. She remembered the silence after, the aching emptiness that no food, no ritual, no prayer could fill. Every cut of her knife was a heartbeat of grief turned to rage. The house grew tense in the days that followed. Thornhill's temper ran hot with drink, and the overseer, Mr. Parsons, grew harsher in his shadow. One morning, a commotion drew Esther to the window. In the yard, Thornhill towered over Jeremiah, who lay doubled on the ground. Even from a distance, she saw blood staining the old man's shirt. "Thieving old devil," Thornhill shouted. "Think I don't count my liquor?" He kicked Jeremiah again. The old man made no sound this time, his frail body absorbing the blows. Beside Thornhill stood Parsons, holding a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Later, Samuel, the young stable boy, whispered the truth. Jeremiah hadn't stolen for drink. He had taken the liquor as medicine for the pain in his joints, the rheumatism that winter made unbearable. The punishment had been 10 lashes. Then Thornhill's fists. Esther tended Jeremiah in secret, bringing herbs and honey to soothe his wounds. In the dim light of the shed where he lay, he gripped her hand with trembling fingers. They'll sell me south, he murmured, fever already clouding his mind. Say I'm too old to keep. Don't speak it, Esther whispered, though her throat tightened, but Jeremiah knew. Days later, infection spread and his breath grew shallow. In delirium, he mistook Esther for someone from long ago, calling her my Sarah. By morning, he was gone. He was buried without ceremony in the slave cemetery beyond the kitchen garden, his grave marked only by a small stone Esther placed when no one was watching. That night, kneeling on the dirt floor of her quarters, Esther pulled the box from beneath the loose board. She unwrapped the faded cloth and held the powder in her palm. The decision was made. This would not be a rash act of vengeance. It would be measured, calculated, precise. Thornhill, Caroline, Parsons, they would taste the fullest measure of justice. The others who feasted on her labor while ignoring her suffering, they would remember this Christmas for the rest of their lives. In antebellum Charleston, human lives were currency. Planters with fortunes in land often lived in debt, gambling away earnings and replenishing them by selling slaves. Families were ripped apart on the auction block, with little more thought than one might give to the sale of cattle. For Esther, this was not an abstract cruelty. It was her life. It was James and Sarah. It was Lucy. It was Jeremiah. Each name was a ledger entry in Thornhill's accounts, and each name was one more reason why Esther's hands trembled no longer when she touched the poison. The Thornhill mansion glittered with holiday polish, but beneath its surface, Esther carried the secret colder than winter's breath. With Jeremiah gone and Lucy sold, something inside her had hardened into iron. The Christmas bowl, long the crown jewel of Charleston's holiday season, would now be her battlefield. 10 days before Christmas, Esther slipped into the shed behind the kitchen garden, a place where she sometimes dried herbs. Tonight it became her laboratory. She unwrapped the small packet the root woman had given her years ago, its white dust looking no different than flour or sugar. In the faint lantern light, Esther used the tip of a knife to stir a speck into a cup of broth. She set it down where a stray cat prowled. The animal lapped eagerly, then staggered, vomiting violently. By morning, it had recovered. She tried again, adjusting the measure. The second cat slept a day, waking weak but alive. The third test, double that dose, proved fatal within hours. Esther watched with grim calm, committing the results to memory. She was a cook, a scientist of survival, and now she was perfecting a new recipe: vengeance. The Christmas menu had already been set by Mistress Caroline. Weeks earlier, oyster stew, glazed ham, roast duck, tenderloin, sweet potatoes laced with bourbon, Carolina rice pilaf, peach cobbler, mince pies, and the crown jewel, a flaming Christmas pudding. For the governor and the guests, it would be a feast of spectacle. For Esther, it would be a stage for judgment. The powder had no distinct scent, only a faint bitterness easily masked by spices and sugar. Better still, Caroline had ordered oil of bitter almonds for the marzipan decorations. Its fragrance would explain away any strange undertones. Esther even devised a distraction. Miss Claire, the fragile daughter of wealthy friends, had dietary restrictions. Caroline demanded a plain plate prepared for her. Esther realized this meant one dish could be dosed differently, enough to make the girl violently ill without killing her. It would draw attention away from her true targets. While her mind sharpened plans, Esther shaped her body into a performance. She began to move slower, rubbing her wrists, sighing as though in pain. She let others see her weariness. Don't you dare fall ill before the ball," Caroline snapped one afternoon. Collapse afterward, if you must, but not before. Yes, mistress, Esther answered, bowing her head, hiding the fire in her eyes. Her act ensured that if questioned later, everyone would recall her showing signs of sickness, not scheming. But vengeance alone was not enough. Esther could not let Ida be swallowed by the same fate that had consumed her children. 2 weeks before the ball, she whispered to Samuel, the young stable hand, who had cared for Jeremiah, "There's a man in the marsh settlement, old Julius. He helps people disappear north. After the ball, there will be trouble here, bad trouble. Ida must be gone." Samuel hesitated, then nodded. "For Jeremiah," he said. That night, Esther slipped Ida half her ration of cornmeal, a small bundle of possessions, and a silver spoon stolen from Caroline's set. "Keep this," she told the girl. "Trade it if you must. It may buy your freedom." From her own treasures, she set aside one last gift, the gold locket her mother had once worn, its chain worn thin from years of hiding. When the time came, it would pass into Ida's keeping. Context break, the underground pathways, enslaved people in the low country whispered of marshmen and safe settlements. These were loose networks of free blacks, maroons, and sometimes sympathetic whites who helped fugitives vanish northward. It was not yet the famed Underground Railroad with its established routes, but fragile paths stitched together by trust, barter, and silence. For Esther, arranging Ida's flight was as much part of her plan as the poison. Revenge was hers, but freedom had to belong to the next generation. By the week of the ball, Esther had hidden small paper twists of the powder in a peppermint tin, tucked into a hollow brick in the fireplace. Each twist bore a tiny scratch mark, 1 for illness, 2 for stupor, 3 for death. The stew would begin the evening, the punch would end it. 4 cups, Thornhill, Parsons, Judge Preston, and Dr. Whitcomb would receive the fatal dusting. Others would get enough to remember. Each step was laid like stones in a path she had no intention of returning from. The mansion's halls filled with the sound of preparation, polished footsteps on wooden floors, the scrape of chairs, the whisper of silk skirts carried to wardrobes. In the kitchen, Esther worked with a quiet rhythm, the motion of her hands hiding the thunder gathering in her chest. Revenge was a path she had chosen, but it wasn't the only road she was laying. She was building another, narrow, dangerous, and threaded through the marsh, meant for 2 younger souls who still had years to claim. Ikeda barely spoke now. Since Lucy's sale, the girl moved like a shadow that had lost its body. Esther kept her close in the kitchen, away from Parsons's eye, away from Caroline's shrill impatience. She assigned Ida to the gentler tasks, sifting flour, polishing a spoon until the room showed its face in it, slicing butter with the edge of a warm knife. "Hold the cloth here," Esther said one afternoon, guiding Ida's fingers toward a hot pot handle. "Not over the flame. Feel where it's cool. You protect the skin God gave you, else they'll take that too." Ida nodded, unable to meet Esther's eyes for long. The welts on her back had faded to a dusky map of scars, but grief still burned fresh. Samuel came to the kitchen at odd hours, always as if by accident. He brought split wood for the stove or a basket of kindling that he set down near the hearth. He was careful, always careful, looking to the doorway and listening for footsteps. The house had grown suspicious since Lucy's sale. Whispers traveled fast, and suspicion traveled faster. "Old Julius is still there," Samuel muttered. "One morning when the kitchen was empty. Says the marsh is crawling with patrols, but there's a flat skiff hidden near the reeds. If a soul can get to it by dark, it drifts quiet as sleep." Esther kept kneading, her fists folding the dough into itself as if she were kneading the whole plan tighter. "After the ball," she said, "when the noise is loudest, when even the rats don't know which way to run." Samuel tipped his head. "You sure?" I'm sure, she said, and she goes without knowing why. Let the girl keep her innocence where she can. Ida glanced up from the table, puzzled by their low voices. Esther turned, smiling a little too quickly. Fetch me the nutmeg, child. Let your hands learn their work, not your ears. As the days crept closer to Christmas, the house filled with parcels, boxes tied in twine, folded fabrics smelling of lavender, crates of oranges packed in straw. Caroline marched through it all with a notebook, ticking, scolding, tallying, as if control were the only shield she had against the world. Thornhill appeared less often, though when he did, the fumes of drink arrived before he did. Governor Johnson is a guest of honor, Caroline announced at the kitchen door, her lips tight around the words. We must present refinement. No mistakes, none. She let her eyes slide to Ida, then back to Esther, as if to say, you keep her from breaking what matters. Esther bowed her head. The deference was easy to counterfeit after so many years of performance. Yes, mistress. But beneath her calm there was a ledger of her own, not of things to be served, but of names and reckonings. Parsons, Preston, Whitcomb, Thornhill. The paper twists hidden behind the loose brick. The one lost item that wasn't for anyone else. No, not for Caroline, not for the governor, for Esther, alone. When the room was empty that night, Esther lifted the corner of Ida's blanket and sat on the pallet's edge. You're breathing too shallow, she whispered. Your body needs food to do the work of living. Ida blinked awake, her eyes shining in the meager light. Marjay? Always a choice. Mahogany. Esther reached into her apron and pulled out a small bundle, a folded cloth with a neat knot. Here. Cornmeal. And this, she placed a gleam in Ida's palm, a silver spoon, with an old pattern carved along the handle. Ida's breath caught. They'll whip us if it's missing. They won't count tonight, Esther said softly. Not the way you think. Nko? Ida studied the spoon as if it were a message from a place she didn't believe was real. What's it for? Trade, passage, safety. The world's full of doors for people who look like they own keys. Esther paused, then brushed a curl from Ida's forehead. When a time comes that feels like the world is splitting, and people rush one way, you and Samuel go the other. He knows how. Ida looked up. Why don't you come with us? Esther smiled. A small, tired thing. My journey's different, child. You always say that, Ida whispered. Because it's true. Ida swallowed. The kitchen creaked as the fire settled in the stove. Outside, the winter wind pushed against the shutters as if trying to get in from the cold. Esther leaned closer. Do you remember what I told you about sharpening a knife? Keep the angle steady, Ida said. Let the stone do the work. So you don't force them. Favis was clans. You don't force them. You line them up and then you wait for the moment. And when it comes, you don't hesitate. Like, Ida nodded slowly, though tears trembled at the edge of her lashes. Esther lifted the girl's hand and closed her fingers around the spoon. Sleep, she said. Tomorrow, you're working with silver again. The plates with the blue edge. If anyone asks, you tell them I said so. A day later, Samuel slipped into the shed under the excuse of kindling. Esther was there already, the lantern low, the smell of dry herbs wrapped around them like a cloak. I saw Jeremiah's stone, Samuel said, his voice catching on the name. I put a small branch there. I thought he might like a bit of shade. Esther didn't speak at first. She was measuring out flour, the small puffs like breath in cold air. He'd like that, she said at last. He liked things that gave cover. Oh, Samuel shifted, then reached into his coat and drew out a narrow scrap of cloth. Old Julius gave me this. Says if someone shows it at the marsh, men will know what help to give. He says it changes often, so no one can follow the pattern too long. Esther took the cloth. It was a strip from a faded bandana with a particular knot tied in the center. We survived this long because we share what can be shared, she murmured, and hide the rest. Who? Samuel leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, eyes on the floor. When the time comes, he said, I'll take her. I won't fail you. I know, Esther said. You'll do it for yourself too. Don't pretend otherwise. You deserve a sky that doesn't ask you to bow to it. A beat passed between them, heavy with things that had never had a name in that house. Mutual regard, trust, that meant more than blood, the religion of solidarity practiced in secret. Then Samuel gave a small nod and stepped into the night. The mansion's transformation gathered speed. Wreaths of pine and holly crowned mantelpieces. Candles were counted, trimmed, and tested. Crystal was lifted against the light, examined for spots, scolded for smudges. The dining room became a theater, and Caroline its director. But common to all theaters is the blindness of the audience. The inability to see the ropes and pulleys that make the spectacle run. Esther ensured those ropes were where she wanted them. Gupta. She set Ida to polishing the plates that would lie nearest the governor's seat, far from the cup she'd marked in her mind. She trained another boy to carry Miss Sinclair's special dish, made from plain roast chicken with an herb glaze so gentle it hardly had a taste. Esther watched the boy lift the plate and set it down again, counting the steps from stove to sideboard to door until she could walk it herself with her eyes shut. You, again, she said, and don't let the plate tilt. I won't, he said, breathless, wiping his palms on his trousers. You will, if you think on your feet instead of feeling the tray through your hands. She moved his fingers a fraction inward. There. Your hands will learn your body if you let them. Let's go. He looked up at her with the timid reverence so common in the Dort house. The faith that Esther's knowledge could keep you alive a day longer, or at least keep Caroline's tongue from lashing you raw. Esther allowed herself a single breath of pride. Skill was one of the only things slavery could not confiscate without your permission. On the morning before Christmas Eve, the apothecary's parcel arrived. Spices wrapped in waxed paper, bright shavings of cinnamon, and, carried between two small glass vials, the oil of bitter almonds for the marzipan. Caroline hovered like a hawk. Use it sparingly, she warned, as if economy were a virtue she intended to practice outside the kitchen. The scent must be elegant, not vulgar. Yes, mistress, Esther said, and quietly thanked whatever ancestors watched over her for this happy accident, the harsh sweetness that could cover a trace the way pegged laundry covers missing shirts. That afternoon, in the lull between chores, Esther sat alone and pressed her palm against the brick face of the hearth. Heat pulsed through clay, the closest thing to a heartbeat the house possessed. She slipped her fingers beneath the loosest brick and removed the peppermint tin. Inside, the small paper twists lay folded, each marked with a scratch only she could recognize even by the light of a single match. One mark meant illness, 2 meant a long night and a longer memory. 3 was the last door a man would walk through. Esther returned the tin to its hiding place and closed her eyes for a moment. She tried to summon James's face, Sarah's voice, but time had blurred them cruelly. Sometimes she feared she had lost them to the fog that cruelty leaves behind. Other times she felt them near as breath, not as faces, but as the force that kept her hands steady. Tomorrow, she whispered into the heat. Tomorrow I buy the future. The sun dropped early that day, as it does in winter, and the house took on the unreal glow of candlelight. The bustle of hanging garlands, tightening ribbons, and buffing silver sounded like the tuning of an orchestra. Esther stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched the corridor stretch toward the dining room. A river of waxed wood broken by braided carpets and the occasional basin someone had left behind and another had snatched up. Down that river her plan would travel, quiet and sure. Ida drifted to her side. You'll be in the dining room? She asked, a timid edge to the question. Toward the end, Esther said. That's the custom. The spectacle, Ida nodded. Samuel said there might be fireworks, so the governor can be impressed. There might be, Esther said. It's a show they put on for each other. Men like to see light where they believe they made it. Will you watch them? Maybe for a breath, Esther said, but I prefer the dar and Tomton's honest about itself. Fourth. Ikaita's mouth quirked in a smile, small but real. Esther felt a flutter she told herself was only hope, nothing so dangerous as happiness. Remember, Esther added, voice dropping low, if you hear shouting, if you see guests running, you do not help. You go to the back, and Samuel takes you the rest of the way. Ida's eyes widened. What shouting? The kind that tells you the old order is cracking, Esther answered. The kind that comes once in a lifetime. Ida held her gaze for a long moment, then inhaled and nodded. I'll do as you say. Good. Esther bent and pressed her lips to Ida's temple, a benediction she had no power to make official, and every right to give. Then you'll see something I've only dreamed of. You'll see a world where your name belongs to no one but you, before the Underground Railroad became a name wrapped in capital letters and reverence. Escape was a patchwork of local knowledge. In the Carolina Lowcountry, marshes were both prison and passage, the kind of place where men on horses feared to ride and men on foot could vanish if they knew the rhythm of the tide. Enslaved people turned labor knowledge, how to mend a skiff, how to read reeds bent by the wind, into survival knowledge. A spoon could buy silence. A scrap of cloth tied in a particular knot could be a passport. And a cook's access to a house's whole bloodstream, food, drink, timing, could become something more than a talent. It could be an instrument. Esther's plan belonged to that hidden history. Not a myth, not a miracle. A choreography of doors, of minutes, of the human need to look where the light is brightest and ignore the corner where a quiet woman stands with her eyes half closed, listening for the turn of fate. On the eve of the ball, Samuel returned to the kitchen's doorway, his hat in his hands, his eyes grainy with the kind of wakefulness that has nothing to do with coffee. Ida stood at the table, rubbing a cloth along the rim of a plate until her shoulder ached. Tonight, Samuel said, when the sky cracks, I'll be by the back path at the far garden where the laurel leans left. If you don't see me, you wait for the second firework. Ida looked to Esther. Esther gave a tiny nod. Samuel hesitated. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold locket. Esther's, warmed by the heat of his palm and by another heat, older and more private. The reverence. He held it out. This belongs with the girl, he said. Esther closed his hand back around it. Tomorrow, she said, when the path opens, not before. Carry it for me until then. Samuel swallowed, and for a heartbeat, emotion made a stranger of him. A boy on the verge of manhood, and a man on the verge of something older. Still, he nodded once, turned, and faded into the corridor's half-light. Esther looked at Ida, at the spoon tucked into the girl's bundle, at the cornmeal and the careful knots. Then she turned to the stove, lifted a pot and set it back down, hands steady. There were still hours of work to do, layers to build, like pastry that only rises if you respect the cold between the folds. Tomorrow would be heat enough for everyone. Christmas Eve dawned clean and sharp, the air like a blade that had tasted ice. By afternoon, a fragile, watery sunlight washed the mansion's white columns until they looked less like stone than bone laid bare. Inside, the house exhaled heat from every hearth. The halls hummed with the ceremony of final things, last polish on the crystal, last press on the linens, last recitation of the night's order, as Caroline marched room to room with her ledger like a magistrate counting souls. In the kitchen, Esther moved as if the clock on the far wall had set itself by the rhythm of her hands. Her face was calm, but her mind counted without ceasing. Minutes, steps, Doses, the distance from stove to sideboard to dining room. The interval between punch ladling and the first swallow. The way fear turns a room into a mirror, making everyone watch everyone else and miss the smallest, surest hand at the edge of their sight. This was not the day for doubt. She started with the oyster stew. The pot simmered low, the cream just shy of a boil, brine softened by butter. A whisper of mace to warm the tongue. Esther lifted a spoon, tasted, nodded. The stew would go out early, before the guests had drunk deeply, before the room's mood swelled like a tide. She would not touch it with powder. It was the right choice, luxurious, expected, safe. Let the familiar reassure them before the turn. Ickle hams had been glazed since morning, their skins lacquered to a mahogany shine. Ducks roasted, their fat basting the meat beneath until the air smelled of winter's feast. The tenderloin rested under clean cloth, juices gathering themselves for a final sear. Sweet potatoes waited in their dish, bourbon tucked inside like a secret warmth. Rice pilaf steamed in a low pot, not cloying, not austere, Carolina's inheritance rising grain by grain. Esther paused at the window. The kitchen garden lay in long shadows, the old herb bed sleeping, the path edged in frost that looked, from this angle, like salt. She thought of all the seasons she had stood in this same place. Summer's tomatoes, autumn's peppers, winter's empty vines, and felt, for an instant, the ache of time as a rope that had rubbed her hands raw. Then she turned back to the stove. Rope makes knots, knots hold. Ueda arrived in her serving dress, face pale but composed, eyes like polished river stones. She didn't ask questions. She stood where Esther pointed, took what Esther handed her, and moved as Esther had taught, steady. Even when the room shouted for haste, it made Esther proud in a way that felt like hunger satisfied and grief restrained in the same breath. Remember, Esther said quietly as she adjusted Ida's apron, when the noise comes, you do not answer it. You follow Samuel. Your heart will try to turn back. You tell it no, Ida swallowed. Yes, Miss Esther. Esther set a hand on the girl's shoulder, brief, firm. Then she turned to the small plate destined for Miss Sinclair. The special dish sat alone as if already set apart by fate. A breast of chicken roasted plain, only a breath of herb teased into a light glaze. Esther drew on her gloves, ostensibly for a cut that did not exist, and reached beneath the brick for the peppermint tin. Inside, the paper twists lay like small commandments. She selected one marked with a single scratch and shook a dusting of the powder onto the meat. Not enough to kill, enough to seize a delicate body and wring it hard. Enough to make the room tilt its head away from where it should be looking. She spooned the mild sauce over the dose, smoothing it so cleanly no eye could tell where anything had been changed. Then she set the plate aside and exhaled through her nose. The first stone had been placed on the path. Now the thresholds could begin to align. By late afternoon, carriages had started their long procession along the circular drive, wheels crushing gravel like ice. Footmen in livery stood in rows, the door servants rehearsed their bows, and wine glasses sang a thin crystal song as they were set onto trays. The Thornhill mansion drew in the city's elite like a lung full of bright air. From the kitchen's threshold, Esther watched fragments of spectacle. Ladies whose gowns made the room feel like a garden even in winter. Gentlemen whose collars lifted their chins as if rank itself had stiffened their necks. Caroline, all nerves and angles, greeting, guiding, glancing at the governor's entourage as if she could arrange the earth's rotation by force of will. William Thornhill himself, already buoyed by drink, wore a host's smile that never came near his eyes. Esther turned from the door and lifted the pot of stew. Go, she said to the servers, steady hands. Heads low, see the table, not the faces. Ida was among them, carrying a bowl no heavier than the burden she was about to lay down. She looked back once. Esther gave the smallest nod. The procession moved out. The main courses passed in a choreography of trays and carving knives, and silent commands mouthed across distance. Esther did not step into the dining room yet. She timed the duck's removal by the shade of their skin. She waited for the tenderloin to open itself under the blade. It sent her blushing just enough. She listened for the tenor of voices through the swinging door. High laughter, the hush that follows when a story turns, the rise that means a toast, the lull that invites another course. You don't need a clock when you have a house breath. Halfway through the mains, the first conversion of the night began. A serving boy slipped through the kitchen, alarm pale on his face. "Miss Sinclair," he said, barely containing his voice. "She's taken ill." Esther wiped her hands slowly, as if taking her time would calm the air. "Cool cloths," she said. "Water. Tell the mistress I will send broth if they call for it, plain as rain." Ida shot Esther a glance. Esther gave none in return. Only that patient, undreadable gaze of a woman who has learned to make her face a neutral ground where enemies cannot leave footprints. Through the door, the room's pitch changed. Chairs scraping, a mother's anxious whisper, the rustle of a girl being helped from her place. The eyes of men turned toward this acceptable drama, a delicate daughter faint with a fashionable ailment. In such moments, people lie to themselves without much effort. It is a kindness they perform for their own comfort. Esther had made room for the lie and left it a soft chair. Now came the punch and pudding, the house's signature duet, the spectacle everyone waited for, the place in the night where indulgence lifted itself into ritual. Esther drew the Christmas pudding from its basin with hands that remembered the exact pressure at the rim. She crowned it with holly and glossed its skin with warmed brandy, until it shone as if a second skin had grown over it, a skin that would burn and devour itself for applause. Neat beside her, in a silver bowl that caught candlelight like a net, the punch was ready to become what the city called Esther's genius. In a lesser house, punch was fruit and rum. In hers, it was a perfume of spice and juice and a few secrets no one had ever managed to pry from her. She reached for the peppermint tin once more. From the heart of the tin, she drew the paper twists marked with 3 scratches and broke them between her fingers, letting the dust fall into the punch like ash into water. She stirred with a long-handled ladle, the motion slow and absolute, the way you move a boat when you want the tide to believe it is carrying you. Then she set 4 crystal cups at the edge of the sideboard, the ones Thornhill favored for his honored associates. She took a final pinch and dusted the rims as lightly as frost. Thornhill, Parsons, Judge Preston, Dr. Witt, Keem. There were other paper twists too, those bearing 2 marks. A couple would go to men who needed reminding that the world could seize them by the throat without warning. Enough to carry memory into the new year, not enough to end a life that might be needed for a later reckoning. A cook thinks in courses. Esther wiped her hands, smoothed her apron, and lifted the pudding onto its platter. She tilted the ladle in the punch bowl and let it rest there. Like a promise, Caroline swept in, tension making her voice bright. "It's time for the pudding and the punch," she declared, smiling too hard. "We must carry on." "Yes, mistress," Esther answered, and her voice was as even as a line drawn with a ruler on clean paper. The corridor from kitchen to dining room had never seemed longer. As Esther walked, the candles made of the polished floor a path of wavering stars. She entered to a hush that rose, as one voice, into delight. The Christmas pudding, doused in brandy and kissed with flame, burned a pure blue, the color of winter's breath made visible. Guests drew back, hands clapping, faces shining. Spectacle makes children of the proud. Behind her came Thornhill, carrying the bowl of punch like a coronation. He played the host with the joy of a man who loves nothing so much as an audience. "My friends," he announced, "we regret the discomfort of dear Miss Sinclair, but Dr. Whitcomb assures us she will be quite well after a rest. Let us not spoil the evening. Let us toast this city, this house, and the good fortune that gathers us." Esther stood at the sideboard and began to slice the pudding. Ida and the others moved like the hands of a clock, plates moving out in expanding circles. Thornhill ladled the punch with flourish, pouring first for Governor Johnson, whose caution, luck, or providence would keep his portion light, then for the chosen men whose cups had been prepared for a different sacrament. "Yo to a prosperous new year," Thornhill declared. Crystal chimed. Cups lifted. Mouths touched rims. Esther watched without seeming to watch, her face the whole of her training. Humble, attentive, grateful for praise that she did not hear. Inside, she began to count. The room swelled and settled in the way people do when sweetness and spirit strike together. Laughter grew looser. Men's shoulders dropped. Women's eyes shone in the low light. Esther moved in her small orbit at the sideboard, slicing, plating, nodding thanks for compliments she had earned with 30 years of labor. No one could properly name. Parsons went first. He lifted a hand to his collar as if the starch had grown into a hand around his throat. His ruddy face deepened in color until it looked bruised. "William," he rasped, a plea disguised as a joke. "Is it me, or did the room get hot as July?" And before Thornhill could answer, Parsons folded forward into his own dessert, the glaze on the pudding staining his cheek in a parody of holiday cheer. For a heartbeat the room hung, suspended between interpretations, drunkenness, a jest gone too far, mere vulgarity. Then the judge made the decision for them. Preston's hand flew to his neck. His eyes went wide like a man who has swallowed river water and felt the current own him. He managed, and then his whole body convulsed, the force of it knocking his wife sideways. Grass shattered along the table's edge, and someone screamed, high, honest, unpracticed, "Doctor." Whitcomb pushed back his chair, physician reflexes moving him toward Preston even as his own fingers shook. He bent, tried a pulse, blinked against a sudden sheen of sweat at his own hairline, a tightness gathering under his ribs, like a fist. He swayed, sat hard, and pressed his palm to his chest with the surprise of a man betrayed by an ally he thought he commanded. Thornhill began to cough, at first like a man who has swallowed humor, then like a man who cannot find air because the world has closed its doors. He tried to speak, to make a joke, to turn this into something controllable. His mouth foamed instead. He looked to Caroline, not as a master to a mistress, but as a man to a wife, not who might turn the storm back by touching his sleeve. "Eat poison," someone shouted, and the word broke across the room like a wave striking glass. Governor Johnson's men formed around him in a rough circle, the protective instinct of men who understand that a body can be both message and target. Ladies fainted with the peculiar grace of women out of breath and out of narrative. Servants froze, then scattered. In chaos, every rule is tested: who goes first, who kneels, who runs. The room had been a theater. Now it was a field. Esther did what a cook does in every emergency. She cleared space. "This way," she urged to the trembling in the still. "Lean him back. Water. No, not that glass. Fresh." She soothed panic with order, shepherded guests toward the hall, ushered a cluster of women into a sitting room, murmured and moved until no one could say where she had been, precisely when each man fell. She was everywhere and nowhere, the way a house's hands are when it is well run. Then she slipped into the corridor, turned once toward the kitchen, and walked there as if going home. Ida and Samuel stood at the kitchen's rear door. Shadows pressed close, as if trying to merge with the dark beyond. Ida clutched a small bundle to her chest. Samuel's jaw worked as if he were chewing on a word that wouldn't soften. "It's time," Esther said. She took the locket from Samuel's palm, the chain warm, the gold dull with age, and pressed it into Ida's hand. "This was my mother's. It belongs to the living now. It belongs to you." Ida's eyes filled. "Come with us," she said, the words breaking on their own edges. "I am," Esther said. "Just not the way you mean." Samuel nodded once. The skiffs in the reeds passed the laurel. "Keep left." Low voices, low oars. "Watch the moon, not the house." "This." Esther lifted her hands, and because there are sacraments that need no church, placed them lightly on either side of Ida's face. "Run on purpose," she whispered, "not in fear." Ida swallowed, then did something almost no one in that house had ever done with Esther. She leaned forward and hugged her, quick as a bird, landing and away again before anyone could call it foolish. Esther's arms closed in return, then released. Samuel took Ida's hand. They slipped through the door, and the cold came in like the truth. Esther stood still, counting one breath, then another, until the kitchen's heat felt like a memory made of wood and smoke. She returned to the dining room's threshold and looked upon the work she had set in motion. Thornhill writhed on the rug, spit on his lips. Parsons lay quiet, face pressed to the plate, as if he had decided to smell the pudding at last. Just Preston's body shook in cruel punctuation, his wife's cries falling like dropped glass. "Doctor?" Whitcomb sat crumpled in a chair, his knowledge of bodies having betrayed him at the only hour. It might have earned redemption. "You." Caroline staggered toward Esther, a hand reaching like an accusation trying to become a grip. "Help them," she demanded. "Do something." "No." Esther looked into the eyes of the woman who had called herself mistress for nearly 30 years, and said in a voice that felt as calm as standing on the bank of a river, "After you've thrown your last stone into its deepest part, there is nothing to be done." Caroline's eyes widened, not with misunderstanding, but with understanding at last. "You," she said, the word a gasp, a curse, a prayer that had discovered it was addressed to the wrong heaven. "You did this." Esther did not nod, she did not smile. She only said quietly, "Their fate was sealed when they first took what was mine." Beyond the windows, fireworks cracked the sky open in blossoms of light. The city's celebration proceeding, as if the world inside the Thornhill dining room had not tilted on its axis. People love to look up. It keeps them from seeing what justice looks like when it comes from below. From the yard came the slam of boots and the harsh call of men who believe that entering a house with authority changes its truth. Esther stepped back into the corridor and turned toward the kitchen, the only room that had ever known her by her full name. And she set a cup on the work table, poured punch into it, and, with hands that did not shake, tipped the last paper twist into the liquid. The bitter rose like a quiet ghost beneath the fruit and spice. She lifted the cup and stood a moment in the hearth's light. She thought of James and Sarah, of the way memory had eroded their faces, leaving outlines and ache. She thought of Jeremiah's grave and the small branch Samuel had set for shade. She thought of Ida and the skiff and the reeds. Then she drank. The poison pressed its cold thumb against her throat. She slid down the hearth's warm bricks and let her head rest, against the place where a cook's back learns the secrets of fire. Her last thought was not a word. It was a taste, something plain and clean, like water drawn from a well in a summer field. It tasted like a door opening. The kitchen held her. And the house did what houses do when the hand that runs them is gone. It kept breathing, but more shallowly, not yet aware that it had learned a new rhythm. Outside, in the dark, two figures moved through the laurel toward the reeds. A silver spoon and a gold locket packed where a heart beats hardest. The fireworks made flowers in the sky no one in the marsh would see. In grand houses of the era, dessert and punch were more than sweets. They were ceremonies that reaffirmed hierarchy. The flaming pudding proved mastery over fire and season. The punch, ladled by the host, demonstrated largesse and control. By subverting these rituals, Esther didn't just poison men. She poisoned the fiction of their invulnerability. Historian accounts often miss this. Enslaved cooks knew the pace, the sequence, the moment when every eye would be elsewhere. The kitchen wasn't only where food was made, it was where attention was relocated. Power follows attention. Esther moved both. Dawn broke cold and clear over Charleston on December 30th. Ichenbad Sisuti, where the night before had shone with carriages and candlelight, the Thornhill mansion now sagged in silence. Officials moved through the house like beetles under a stone, their lanterns throwing hard light across rooms still scented with smoke and brandy. Curtains had been drawn, but nothing could block the murmur of a gathering crowd beyond the iron gates. Curious onlookers, rival families, enslaved men and women from neighboring estates, and reporters clutching notebooks for the Charleston Mercury. The facts as they emerged were these: young William Thornhill, dead; Parsons, the overseer, dead; Jusers Preston, dead; Dr. Whitcomb, dead. Several guests sickened, some near death. Mistress Caroline collapsed, wavering between fever and shock. And Esther, Thornhill's cook, a Negro woman of approximately 40, also dead. An empty cup near her body, the last trace of poison clinging to its rim. The authorities whispered of conspiracy, of a larger plot involving the slaves. Their suspicion sharpened when two were found missing, Ida and Samuel. But the chaos had covered their tracks, and by the time search parties were dispatched, the pair had vanished into the marshlands. Within 3 days, the Mercury printed its headline. Charistima's poisoning, prominent citizens, struck down by vengeful slave. The article painted Thornhill as a generous patriarch beloved by all, while Esther was described as sullen, secretive, prone to dark moods. No mention was made of children sold, of Lucy, of Jeremiah's burial. No mention of lashes, scars, or the silence forced into a life. Other planters clucked their tongues in outrage. Some pushed new restrictions into law. Enslaved cooks could not handle food unsupervised. Servants could not purchase spices or liquor without a master's signature. Slave patrols thickened along Charleston's roads. Fear more than grief drove the changes. In the city's parlors, the tragedy became a warning whispered over porcelain teacups. Trust them too much, and you risk your table. But in the slave quarters, Esther's name became something else entirely. Not Esther the poisoner, Esther the deliverer. Esther who dared. Her story traveled mouth to mouth, kitchen to kitchen. Field hands carried it when they were hired out. Market women exchanged it with bundles of greens. The cook who struck back, they said in low voices. The woman who fed justice to those who never tasted hunger. Every retelling was a little different. Sometimes she lived, sometimes she escaped north, sometimes she turned into a bird that flew over the auction block. But always at the center was the fire of her final choice. A woman who had been silenced her whole life, speaking at last through food. Meanwhile, miles away, Ida and Samuel walked into winter. Nights were long, days cold, but each step took them farther from the Thornhill gates. Esther's locket paid for ferries and silence, for shelter in barns and directions along hidden tracks. By January, they reached North Carolina, where abolitionist Quakers sheltered them in a farmhouse attic. There, Ida wept in the dark, holding the locket against her chest. Samuel told her the full story he'd heard from fleeing servants. How Esther had stood calm as chaos bloomed. How she'd drunk her own cup rather than be taken. She knew, Ida whispered. She knew she wouldn't escape. She gave it all for us. For us, Samuel agreed, and for Jeremiah, and for her children. By February, they were in Philadelphia. The Anti-Slavery Society gave Ida work as a domestic servant, Samuel as a stable hand. They lived separate lives, but met when they could, bound by memory. On Christmas Eve, Ichenbaba Sizabat, 1 year after Esther's final feast, they walked together through snow-dusted streets, stopping on a bridge over the Schuylkill River. From her pocket, Ida pulled out Esther's locket. Inside, she had tucked a scrap of headscarf, worn soft by touch. She gave us freedom, Ida whispered. We'll carry her always. Side by side, they held the locket in silence as the river flowed beneath them, dark, steady, unstoppable. Back in Charleston, time buried the Thornhill Christmas massacre in layers of respectable history. The mansion was sold, then resold, its past folded into ledgers and deeds. Esther's grave lay unmarked in the slave cemetery, lost under weeds. But memory is not always written in stone. It can be carried in mouths and hands, in stories told at firesides, in recipes whispered to daughters, in names spoken in reverence where masters cannot hear. Through such quiet channels, Esther lived on, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that even in bondage, there were moments when the enslaved seized back a measure of power. History remembers the powerful by the names carved in stone: governors, judges, masters, merchants. Their portraits hang in halls, their deeds written in books. But history also breathes through those who had no monuments, only scars. Through women like Esther, whose name is absent from official ledgers except as a cook, a Negro woman of about 40. Her story was nearly erased. No marker stands over her grave. No plaque notes her hand in Charleston's history. But silence cannot always hold it. Through whispers in quarters, through the memory of Ida and Samuel, through the stories passed down by those who survived Esther lives. What she did was not madness. It was not sudden. It was 28 years of loss and labor sharpened into one final act. Her revenge was not only for herself, but for her children, for Jeremiah, for Lucy, for Ida, and for every enslaved soul who carried grief in silence. In striking at the Thornhills' table, she struck at the illusion of control. She reminded Charleston's elites that the hands they exploited were not merely hands. They belonged to people who thought, who remembered, who could act. She used the very tools they forced into her hands, pots, spices, sugar, fire, to turn their own world upside down. Esther's story was not unique. Throughout the Americas, enslaved cooks, nurses, and field hands sometimes resisted in ways hidden from the record, slowing work, breaking tools, passing news, running north, or, on rare occasions, taking deadly revenge. We know the few names: Tituba in Salem, who spoke in a court that sought to silence her; Celia in Missouri, who defended herself against her master; Nat Turner in Virginia, who raised rebellion in Ichenbaba Sensory. But for every one preserved in history books, there were hundreds like Esther buried under weeds, their stories nearly lost. Her tale reminds us that resistance wore many faces. Not always banners and battles, but quiet, deliberate acts of defiance. Even the decision to live another day in the face of bondage was itself a rebellion. Ida and Samuel lived. They built lives in Philadelphia, working for wages they could call their own. They carried Esther's locket, and each Christmas they remembered. Whether they married, whether their children knew the full story, the record does not say. But in their survival, Esther's sacrifice bore fruit. Each mile they traveled north, each step away from chains, was part of her vengeance too. For them, freedom was not just an escape. It was a promise they carried forward. Today, the Thornhill mansion no longer stands. Its name fades in Charleston's long shadow of grand houses and forgotten cemeteries. But Esther's story cuts through time like a blade, reminding us that even in the darkest corners of history, there were voices that refused silence. Her act forces us to ask hard questions. What would you endure before you said enough? What does justice look like when law denies you humanity? Right? And how do we honor those who fought back, even when their names were nearly lost? This is the story of Esther Johnson, born enslaved, died defiant, remembered in whispers. On Christmas night, each ended by Sister T. She poisoned her master and his circle, then chose her own ending, rather than let them claim her one last time. She left no written words, no diary, no confession. Her final message was carved into the bodies of men who thought themselves untouchable, and her legacy was carried north by two young people who spoke her name so it would not vanish. If this story stirs something in you, remember, history is not only in books and monuments. It lives in the shadows, in the stories, almost erased, in the acts of courage whispered down through generations. Esther's voice comes to us across centuries, reminding us of the brutal cost of bondage and the unyielding will to resist. If you want more untold histories like this, story of survival, defiance, and forgotten courage, subscribe to this channel. Together, we can keep these voices alive.